Ars Notoria, Episode 5, Chapter 3, The Birth of the Operator Mind, the Observer. Most people spend their entire lives inside the event layer. They watch the world the way one watches weather. Something happens. They react. A new policy appears. A market moves. A crisis unfolds. And the observer attempts to interpret the event after it has already occurred. From inside this perspective, reality appears unpredictable. Events seem to emerge suddenly. Decisions appear random. Power appears mysterious. The observer tries to understand what happened only after the visible signal arrives. They analyze, they debate, they argue about causes. But the deeper dynamics of the system remain hidden from view. This creates a peculiar relationship with reality. The observer lives in a constant state of reaction, waiting for the next signal, waiting for the next announcement, waiting for the next disruption that demands interpretation. Attention becomes trapped at the surface. And because the surface of reality moves quickly, the observer's perception becomes fragmented. Every new event demands explanation. Every shift in the visible world appears urgent. The observer feels compelled to keep up, to react, to interpret, to form conclusions about movements that were already underway long before they became visible. But something strange begins to happen once a person studies systems long enough. The pace of events begins to slow down, not because the world has changed, but because perception has changed. Instead of watching the surface continuously, attention begins drifting beneath it. Signals that once appeared insignificant begin repeating. Small patterns appear in unexpected places. Incentives reveal themselves through behavior. Feedback loops begin explaining movements that once seemed chaotic. Gradually, the observer notices something unsettling. The event layer is not the engine of reality. It is the echo, the visible trace of movements that began much earlier inside the system. Once this realization settles in, the role of the observer becomes uncomfortable. Because the observer sees events, but the system was already moving long before the observer began reacting. And this is the moment when a new possibility appears. A person can remain an observer, reacting to events, explaining them, debating them, living inside the theater of visible change, or something else can begin to happen. The mind can shift. It can begin asking different questions, not what just happened, but what was already moving before it happened. That shift marks the first step toward a different kind of perception, the moment when the observer begins to transform into something else, something far rarer, the beginning of the operator mind. The first shift. The transformation from observer to operator does not happen suddenly. It begins with a subtle change in attention. At first, the observer still sees events. They still read headlines. They still notice decisions, crises, and announcements. But gradually, something else enters perception. A question begins repeating quietly beneath the surface. Not simply what happened, but what made this inevitable. This question changes everything. Because once the mind begins asking it consistently, events stop appearing isolated. Connections begin to appear. A policy announcement reveals the pressure that produced it. A market movement reveals incentives that had been shifting quietly for months. A sudden cultural change reveals networks that had already been carrying the idea long before the public noticed. The observer starts recognizing preparation. Events no longer look like beginnings. They begin to look like conclusions. This realization can be unsettling, because it means the world has been moving long before the observer began reacting. And once the mind sees this pattern, it cannot easily return to the old perspective. Attention begins scanning differently. Instead of watching for dramatic moments, it begins watching for signals, repeated behavior across networks, small adjustments in incentives, subtle shifts in how institutions respond to pressure. These signals rarely appear dramatic. Most people ignore them. They look too small to matter. But to a mind that has begun studying systems, they reveal something important: direction. The system is not simply reacting to events. It is moving through patterns that exist long before the event becomes visible. This is the first real shift toward the operator mind. The observer reacts to the visible signal. The operator begins noticing the invisible preparation. And once someone begins seeing that preparation consistently, reality begins to feel very different. Events no longer control perception. Instead, perception begins following the deeper movement beneath them. It is as if the mind has stepped half a layer deeper into the architecture of the world, still watching events, but now seeing the system that produces them. Why most minds never shift. At first glance, the movement from observer to operator appears intellectual. It looks like a matter of knowledge, as if some people simply learn more, think harder, or become better at analyzing systems. But the real barrier is rarely intelligence. It is psychological. Most minds never make the shift because the event layer is emotionally rewarding. Events are immediate. They produce urgency. They generate reaction. And reaction gives the mind something it craves: significance. When a person reacts to an event, they feel involved. A crisis appears, and they form an opinion. A public conflict erupts, and they choose a side. A new shock enters the system, and they interpret it, discuss it, share it, and emotionally attach themselves to it. This creates a loop. The mind begins depending on visible events for stimulation. It waits for the next signal, the next controversy, the next disruption. Over time, this habit becomes deeper than attention. It becomes identity. The person stops merely observing events. They begin living through them. This is why the shift towards systems perception is so difficult, because seeing systems requires a different kind of mind, a quieter mind, a slower mind, a mind willing to stay with patterns that do not yet feel dramatic. And most people resist that silence. They mistake it for emptiness. They mistake it for inactivity. But beneath that silence, something more demanding is happening. The mind is learning to tolerate delayed meaning. Instead of needing immediate explanation, it begins holding incomplete patterns in suspension. Instead of reacting to what is visible, it starts tracking what is forming. This requires psychological restraint. The observer wants certainty quickly. The operator can remain inside uncertainty long enough for structure to emerge. That difference is enormous. Because once a mind becomes addicted to immediate reaction, it loses the patience required for deeper perception. And once patience disappears, systems become invisible again. The person falls back into the event layer, not because they are incapable of seeing more, but because their attention has been trained to seek emotional urgency instead of structural clarity. This is why the birth of the operator mind is not simply a gain in knowledge. It is a reordering of attention, a shift in what the mind finds meaningful. The observer is stimulated by what explodes. The operator is guided by what accumulates. And once that shift happens, reality begins opening in a completely different way. Seeing structure. When the operator mind begins to form, something fundamental changes in how the world appears. Events no longer dominate perception. They still exist. They still matter. But they stop feeling like the center of reality. Instead, the operator begins noticing something far more powerful: structure. Structure is the silent architecture that holds systems together. In every domain of reality, systems rely on underlying structures to maintain stability. Political institutions depend on incentive structures. Economic systems rely on feedback mechanisms. Organizations operate through hierarchies of influence and constraint. Even cultural movements follow structural channels that determine how ideas spread, mutate, and stabilize. Most observers never notice these structures. They see only the visible outcomes. A decision is announced. A market shifts. A cultural narrative explodes across networks. But by the time those signals appear, the structural movement that produced them has already been unfolding quietly for months, sometimes years. The operator mind begins looking for these deeper arrangements. Instead of asking what happened, it asks where the pressure was building. Instead of reacting to a visible change, it studies the system that made that change inevitable. This approach transforms perception. Suddenly, the world begins to feel less chaotic, not because uncertainty disappears, but because the mind is now tracking the forces that shape outcomes long before they become visible. Patterns begin appearing everywhere. Incentives reveal behavior. Constraints reveal direction. Repeated responses across institutions reveal deeper alignments of pressure and influence. The operator begins recognizing that systems rarely move randomly. They move along structural pathways. When pressure accumulates within a structure, the system eventually releases that pressure through an event. The event attracts public attention, but the structure is what made it possible. This is why two identical events can produce completely different outcomes in different systems, because the structures beneath them are different. The observer focuses on the visible signal. The operator studies the invisible framework. Over time, this perspective changes how decisions are made. The observer waits for events before responding. The operator positions themselves within structures long before events arrive. This difference creates a powerful advantage. Because once a person understands where structural pressure is accumulating, they begin predicting movement before it becomes visible. They see the channels through which change must eventually travel. And once those channels become visible, action can be taken early, quietly, without urgency, without panic. Position replaces reaction. Patience replaces impulse. The operator no longer feels controlled by events. Instead, events begin confirming movements that were already anticipated. This is not prediction in the mystical sense. It is simply structural awareness. Systems behave according to the architecture that contains them. When the architecture becomes visible, the future stops feeling like a mystery. It becomes a pattern unfolding through time, and the operator mind learns to move within that pattern long before most people realize it exists. Position before movement. Once the operator begins seeing structures, a new realization appears. Systems rarely change at the moment of the event. They change earlier, when pressure is still invisible to most observers. This creates a decisive moment inside every system, a moment when the structure is already under tension, but the surface still appears stable. Observers ignore this phase. To them, nothing important is happening yet. There is no crisis, no visible disruption, no signal demanding reaction. But the operator recognizes something different. Pressure is accumulating inside the structure. Incentives are shifting. Actors within the system begin adjusting their behavior in small, quiet ways. Institutions start testing limits. Information flows begin changing direction. These signals are rarely dramatic. Most people overlook them entirely. But together they reveal a structural phase that is extremely important. Pre-movement. Pre-movement is the stage when the system is already changing internally, even though the visible layer has not yet caught up. And this stage offers the greatest strategic advantage. Because once the visible event occurs, positioning becomes difficult. Everyone sees the change at the same time. Competition appears instantly. Actors begin reacting simultaneously. But during pre-movement, very few people are paying attention. The structure is shifting quietly, and quiet shifts allow strategic positioning. This is where the operator mind behaves differently from the observer. The observer waits for confirmation. The operator studies tension. Instead of asking whether a change has already happened, the operator studies where change is becoming inevitable, where incentives are drifting, where institutions are losing stability, where networks are quietly reorganizing themselves. Once these signals become visible, positioning begins. But positioning does not mean confrontation. In fact, the most effective positioning often appears passive. The operator does not fight the system. They move along its structural pathways, aligning with forces that are already pushing in a particular direction. This makes the movement appear natural, effortless, because it is not driven by reaction, it is guided by structural alignment. When the visible event finally appears, the operator is already inside the movement, already positioned, already aligned with the direction the system must follow. Observers interpret this as foresight, or luck, or influence. But the reality is simpler. The operator moved during the quiet phase, when the structure was shifting, but attention was elsewhere. This difference between reacting and positioning defines the real advantage of the operator mind. The observer competes inside the moment of change. The operator prepares before the moment arrives. And when the system finally releases its pressure through visible events, the operator does not scramble to react. They simply continue moving with the current that was already forming long before the surface began to move. Moving without resistance. Once a mind begins positioning inside systems, a second realization appears. Direct force rarely produces the outcomes people expect. Most observers assume that influence comes from confrontation. They imagine that change requires pressure, persuasion, or visible control. But systems rarely respond well to direct pressure. Structures resist sudden force. Institutions defend stability. Networks reorganize themselves to neutralize actors that appear disruptive. This is why many attempts to change systems fail. The actors involved try to push the system, but the system pushes back. The operator learns a different principle. Real movement rarely begins with force. It begins with alignment. Every system has internal currents, incentives that guide behavior, constraints that limit action, feedback loops that stabilize certain patterns while discouraging others. When someone tries to force a movement against those currents, the system reacts defensively. Resistance appears immediately. Institutions close ranks. Networks mobilize to protect stability. Even individuals inside the system begin pushing against the disruption. But when movement aligns with existing currents, the system behaves differently. Instead of resisting, it begins assisting. Structures that once looked rigid begin opening pathways. Institutions adapt. Networks amplify the movement rather than suppressing it. This is why the operator rarely begins by asking what they want to change. Instead, they begin by studying how the system already wants to move, where incentives are drifting, where constraints are weakening, where existing actors are quietly adjusting their behavior. These signals reveal the direction of least resistance. Once that direction becomes visible, movement becomes easier. The operator does not push against the structure. They guide their actions along the same pathway the structure is already opening. To an outside observer, this can look almost effortless. The operator seems to move smoothly through spaces where others encounter constant resistance. Decisions fall into place. Opportunities appear. Institutions cooperate rather than obstruct. But this is not the result of personal influence alone. It is the result of structural alignment. The operator is not fighting the system. They are moving with it. This approach also changes the tempo of action. Observers often rush into confrontation because they interpret visible events as urgent. Operators remain patient. They wait until structural alignment is clear. They move when the system itself begins shifting. At that moment, the smallest action can produce the largest effect, because the system's own momentum amplifies the movement. This is the quiet advantage of the operator mind. Force becomes unnecessary, resistance becomes rare, and movement becomes far more powerful precisely because it appears so subtle, invisible, while the system moves. Once someone learns how to move with a system instead of against it, another realization begins to emerge. The most effective operators often do not look powerful from the outside. In many cases, they barely look important at all. This is one of the strangest things about real influence. The public mind is trained to recognize visible force, a loud voice, a dominant personality, a figure standing at the center of attention. Most people instinctively assume that the person occupying the visible center must also be the one shaping the outcome. But complex systems rarely work that way. In highly visible environments, the center of attention is often the place with the least freedom. The person in the spotlight is constrained by perception. Every gesture is watched. Every statement is interpreted. Every move triggers reaction. Visibility creates pressure. Pressure narrows movement. The more exposed an actor becomes, the more the system begins organizing itself around containing, translating, or neutralizing that actor's influence. This is why the operator mind eventually becomes cautious about visibility. Not fearful, strategic. The operator understands that being seen too early can reduce leverage. A movement that becomes visible before it is structurally supported will attract resistance before it can spread. A person who reveals their direction too early invites the system to defend itself. Institutions close ranks. Networks begin adjusting defensively. Narratives shift to contain the movement before it reaches scale. So the operator learns something counterintuitive. Sometimes the strongest position inside a system is not to dominate the visible layer. It is to remain just beneath it. Close enough to influence flows, far enough to avoid becoming the object of immediate resistance. This creates a very different relationship with power. The observer associates power with recognition. The operator associates power with movement. If the system is moving in the direction they anticipated, visible recognition becomes secondary. The result matters more than the display. This is why many high-level operators appear strangely quiet. They do not rush to announce intention. They do not constantly perform significance. They do not need the visible layer to validate their position. Instead, they focus on placement. Which network carries influence? Which incentive structure is shifting? Which node inside the system can amplify a small action? By the time the visible world begins discussing the change, the operator has often already moved beyond the decisive moment. This invisibility produces a kind of asymmetry. The system reacts most strongly to visible threats, but the operator is not presenting themselves as a threat. They are embedding themselves into movement that is already forming. From the outside, this can look like passivity, as though they are simply there, while history moves on its own. But this interpretation misses what is actually happening. The operator is not absent. They are positioned. And the difference between absence and positioning is enormous. Absence contributes nothing. Positioning allows the system's own dynamics to carry influence forward without attracting unnecessary resistance. This is one of the reasons operators often look less dramatic than leaders, less charismatic than public intellectuals, and less forceful than visible authorities. Drama is expensive. Charisma attracts projection. Force invites opposition. Quiet placement, by contrast, allows the system to do much of the visible work. The operator intervenes where structure is sensitive, then steps back enough for loops, incentives, and networks to propagate the movement. At that point, the system begins appearing to move on its own. And to the public it often does. But beneath that apparent spontaneity lies a different reality. Someone recognized the pressure before it surfaced. Someone positioned themselves where the structure would become responsive. Someone acted at the right depth, with the right timing, and with just enough force to let the system amplify the movement without immediately defending against it. This is why real influence often disappears behind the event it helped create. And this is also why so many people misunderstand power. They look for the person who appears largest on the surface. The operator looks for the movement that is actually shaping the system. One sees theater, the other sees mechanics. And once that difference becomes clear, visibility itself begins to look less like proof of power and more like one of the system's favorite distractions. The system becomes visible. Once a person begins thinking structurally, perception undergoes a deeper transformation. At first, the operator simply recognizes patterns earlier than most observers. Signals that once seemed insignificant begin revealing direction. Pressure becomes detectable before the event appears. Incentives begin explaining behavior that once looked irrational. But over time, the change becomes more profound. The system itself becomes visible. Not visually in the literal sense, but perceptually. Where the observer once saw separate events, the operator begins seeing a continuous field of movement. Institutions stop looking like isolated actors. They begin appearing as nodes inside a larger structure. Policies reveal the incentives beneath them. Conflicts reveal pressure between structural layers. Sudden shifts reveal long accumulations of imbalance, finally releasing themselves. The world begins feeling less like a collection of stories, and more like an architecture. An architecture made of incentives, constraints, and feedback loops interacting continuously across time. Inside that architecture, events are no longer mysterious. They become signals, surface ripples produced by deeper movements. Once this perception stabilizes, something remarkable happens. The pace of the world appears to slow down, not because reality is moving more slowly, but because the operator is no longer surprised by most events. They have already seen the structural direction forming. A crisis arrives, but the operator recognized the pressure months earlier. A narrative suddenly spreads across networks, but the operator saw the conditions that would make it contagious long before it appeared. A decision emerges from an institution, but the operator already understood the incentive structure shaping that decision. For the observer, these moments feel sudden. For the operator, they feel almost inevitable. This creates a strange asymmetry in perception. Observers experience the world as unstable. Operators experience the world as patterned. Observers feel that events constantly disrupt their understanding. Operators watch events confirm patterns that were already visible beneath the surface. This difference changes the emotional relationship with reality. The observer reacts. The operator studies. The observer becomes overwhelmed by the speed of events. The operator becomes calmer as events accelerate, because the faster the surface moves, the more clearly the structural currents beneath it begin to reveal themselves. In chaotic environments, structure becomes easier to detect. Pressure exposes pathways. Institutions reveal their internal priorities. Networks show where influence truly flows. And once the operator recognizes these flows, the system stops looking chaotic at all. It begins looking directional. Movement has trajectories. Tension has release points. Structures have limits. This does not make the future perfectly predictable. Complex systems always contain uncertainty. But it changes the nature of uncertainty. Instead of feeling random, uncertainty becomes bounded by structure. The operator knows where the system can move, and more importantly, where it cannot. This awareness creates something powerful: strategic patience. Observers often feel compelled to act quickly. Events produce urgency. Narratives produce pressure. The system appears to demand immediate response. But the operator has already seen the deeper movement. They know that acting too early can reveal positioning before the system is ready. They know that acting too late means competing with everyone else reacting to the event layer. So they wait. Not passively, attentively, tracking the structural currents as they strengthen, watching pressure accumulate at certain nodes, waiting for the moment when the system itself begins releasing that pressure. At that moment, movement becomes easier. Smaller actions produce larger outcomes, because the system is already moving. And this is the true advantage of the operator mind. Not control. Control is an illusion inside complex systems. The real advantage is timing, knowing when the system is about to move, and placing oneself exactly where that movement will pass. The illusion of prediction. One of the most misunderstood qualities of the operator mind is the appearance of prediction. Observers often describe certain individuals as if they possess a mysterious ability to foresee events. They say things like, How did he know that would happen? How could she predict this months before everyone else? It's almost like they can see the future. But the operator is not seeing the future. They are seeing structure. Most people interpret reality through events. An event happens, and then the mind tries to explain it. The explanation is built afterward. This creates the impression that the world moves through sudden surprises. A crisis appears, a market collapses, a political shift erupts, a technological transformation accelerates. From the perspective of the observer, these events feel abrupt, unexpected, almost chaotic. But systems rarely move that way. Long before an event becomes visible, the structure producing it has already been forming. Pressure accumulates. Incentives align. Networks shift direction. Constraints begin tightening around certain possibilities while opening pathways for others. The operator mind is trained to notice these structural signals early. Instead of waiting for the event itself, the operator watches the forces that make the event inevitable. This difference changes perception entirely. Imagine observing a dam. An observer sees a solid wall holding back water. Everything appears stable. Nothing seems dramatic. But an engineer notices small fractures in the concrete. They observe the pressure building behind the structure. They see water slowly seeping through microscopic weaknesses. To the observer, the dam looks strong. To the engineer, the collapse is already underway. If the dam eventually breaks, the observer experiences shock. The engineer experiences confirmation. Not because they predicted the exact moment of collapse, but because the structural conditions made collapse increasingly unavoidable. This is how operators experience systems. They watch pressures building inside institutions. They observe incentive structures shifting behavior across networks. They see narratives preparing the psychological ground for certain actions. They detect instability long before it reaches the surface. When the visible event finally occurs, it appears as though they predicted it. In reality, they simply read the architecture that was already moving toward that outcome. This distinction is crucial. Prediction implies guessing the future. Structural awareness recognizes inevitabilities emerging from present conditions. The operator does not ask, "What will happen?" They ask, "What is becoming impossible to stop?" And that question changes everything. Because once structural inevitabilities become visible, time itself begins to feel different. Observers react when events appear. Operators prepare when pressures form. Observers think in days or weeks. Operators think in structural cycles, months, years, sometimes decades. The deeper someone understands systems, the earlier signals become detectable. What looks like foresight to the observer is simply earlier perception. The operator is watching the system several layers below the visible surface. By the time the surface moves, the deeper layer has already shifted direction. This creates the strange reputation operators often acquire. People begin attributing intuition or extraordinary intelligence to them. Some even assume mystical insight. But the mechanism is simpler. They learn to read structure, and structure moves before events do. There is another layer to this realization. Once someone becomes skilled at recognizing structural inevitabilities, their relationship with action changes. Observers act in response to events. Operators act in response to pressure. If they see structural pressure building toward a certain outcome, they position themselves before the visible shift occurs. Not dramatically, not loudly, quietly. Positioning early allows them to move with the system when the event arrives. When the visible world finally reacts, the operator is already in motion. From the outside, this looks like perfect timing. But the timing was not magical. It was structural. The system had already begun moving. The operator simply moved with it. And this is the deeper realization hidden beneath the illusion of prediction. The most powerful minds are not forecasting the future. They are reading the architecture of the present. Why most minds cannot see it. If structural inevitabilities are already forming beneath the surface of reality, a natural question follows. Why do so few people notice them? Why do entire societies remain surprised by outcomes that, in hindsight, appear almost obvious? The answer is not a lack of intelligence. It is a matter of perceptual conditioning. From an early age, most people are trained to understand the world through events rather than through systems. Schooling rewards the ability to memorize outcomes, not the ability to analyze the forces that produce those outcomes. Media environments amplify dramatic moments, but rarely examine the slow structural movements that make those moments possible. Public conversation focuses on personalities and decisions, rather than on incentives and constraints. Over time, this produces a particular cognitive habit. The mind begins to interpret reality as a sequence of isolated episodes. A policy appears, a crisis erupts, a leader rises, a technology disrupts an industry. Each event is treated as a separate story, disconnected from the deeper structural currents that shaped it. The public becomes fluent in narrative, but nearly blind to architecture. This blindness is not accidental. Event-focused thinking is easier to manage. Events produce emotion. Emotion produces engagement. Engagement sustains attention. The visible layer of reality becomes a continuous theater of reactions, where attention constantly moves from one surface shock to the next. In such an environment, the deeper structures remain largely invisible. The operator mind breaks this pattern. Instead of asking what just happened, it asks what conditions made the event increasingly unavoidable. Instead of asking who made a decision, it asks what structural incentives constrained that decision long before it appeared. Instead of asking what people are saying publicly, it asks what behaviors are quietly adjusting beneath the language. These questions move perception into a different layer of reality. But reaching that layer requires abandoning a comforting illusion: the illusion of control. Event-focused thinking allows people to believe that visible actors are fully responsible for what happens. If something goes wrong, blame can be assigned to an individual. If something succeeds, credit can be given to leadership. The story remains simple. Agency appears clear. Structural thinking complicates this picture. When systems are examined closely, individual actors begin to look less like authors of events and more like participants inside constraint fields. Decisions that appear bold from the outside often become understandable responses to incentive structures, once those structures are mapped clearly. What looks like sudden change often reveals itself as the final release of pressure that has been building for years. For many observers, this realization feels unsettling. It reduces the comfort of simple explanations. It reveals how strongly behavior is shaped by systems that few people fully understand. And it exposes how frequently public narratives conceal the deeper mechanics that drive outcomes. This is one reason structural perception is rare. It forces the mind to hold a more complex model of reality. The operator must track multiple layers simultaneously: visible events, institutional incentives, network alignments, narrative dynamics, and the evolving constraints that shape what actors inside the system can realistically do. Maintaining that awareness requires sustained attention and a tolerance for ambiguity. Most people prefer clarity. Events provide that clarity. Systems rarely do. Yet once the operator mind stabilizes, the apparent complexity begins organizing itself into patterns. Incentives reveal direction. Constraints reveal boundaries. Feedback loops reveal acceleration points. The system stops feeling chaotic and begins to feel structured. At this point, another shift occurs. The operator realizes that structural blindness is not evenly distributed. Some environments are designed to encourage it. In systems where stability depends on maintaining certain narratives, attention is directed toward visible conflicts, while deeper structural changes unfold quietly. Public discourse becomes a surface game of reactions and counter-reactions, while the underlying architecture continues evolving out of sight. For observers who remain inside the event layer, the system appears unpredictable. For the operator, the system becomes increasingly legible. This difference produces the strange effect often associated with strategic intelligence. Operators seem calm when everyone else feels uncertain. They appear unsurprised when outcomes finally arrive. Their actions often precede visible shifts by just enough time to look deliberate, even prophetic. But the mechanism behind this calm is simple. They are not reacting to the moment. They are watching the structure. Once structural forces become visible, surprise begins disappearing. Events still occur, but they rarely arrive without warning. The question that replaces prediction. Once structural perception stabilizes, the operator mind undergoes a final transformation. Earlier, the mind was focused on events. Then it learned to perceive systems. But eventually, even that framework begins to shift. Because once systems become visible, prediction itself starts to feel like the wrong question. Observers ask, what will happen next? Analysts refine the question slightly and ask, what outcome is most likely? But the operator mind begins asking something more precise. What is the system preparing itself to allow? This difference may appear subtle at first, yet it radically changes how reality is interpreted. Prediction implies that the future must be guessed. Structural permission implies that the future emerges from conditions that are already forming in the present. Every complex system contains invisible boundaries of possibility. Inside those boundaries, certain movements are easy, others are extremely difficult, and some remain temporarily impossible. Most observers never notice these boundaries. They watch personalities making decisions. They listen to institutions announcing policies. They interpret speeches, declarations, strategies, and public narratives. From this perspective, the world appears to move through human intention. Leaders decide. Organizations choose. Governments act. But beneath these visible layers lies something more powerful, an invisible field surrounding every actor inside the system. This field is composed of incentives, constraints, dependencies, feedback loops, and accumulated pressures that have been building across time. That field quietly determines what actions can survive. A leader may want to move in a particular direction, but if the structural field surrounding them does not support that direction, the decision will collapse under pressure. An institution may publicly announce transformation, but if the internal incentives of the organization still reward old behavior, the system will slowly pull itself back into the previous pattern. This is why intentions alone rarely change systems. Structures absorb intentions. Structures filter them. Structures determine which ones endure. The operator mind studies this invisible field. Instead of asking whether someone intends to act, the operator asks whether the system itself would allow that action to survive. Intentions are fragile. Structures are durable. Because of this, the operator begins paying attention to a subtle phenomenon: structural permission. Structural permission does not mean approval. It means feasibility. It means the system has reached a state where certain movements can occur without immediate collapse. When incentives align in a particular direction, the system begins quietly opening pathways. What once seemed impossible becomes merely difficult. What once seemed difficult becomes plausible. And what once seemed unlikely slowly begins transforming into inevitability. Observers rarely notice this shift. They are waiting for visible confirmation. They wait for headlines. They wait for declarations. They wait for public acknowledgement. But the operator mind notices something earlier, the moment when resistance begins weakening, when structures stop blocking a certain movement, when the system quietly reorganizes itself around a possibility. At that moment, prediction becomes unnecessary, because the direction of movement has already been encoded into the architecture of the present. Consider technological transformations. Long before a technology dominates the world, structural conditions begin changing. Infrastructure begins forming. Capital begins flowing. Education systems begin adjusting to new competencies. Institutions begin adapting to new capabilities. And most importantly, resistance begins weakening. To observers, the moment of technological dominance appears sudden. A platform explodes. A new system replaces the old one. An industry transforms overnight. But to the operator mind, the decisive moment happened earlier. It happened when the system began reorganizing itself around the possibility. From that point forward, the outcome was no longer theoretical. It had entered the architecture of permission. This realization changes how the operator acts. Instead of trying to force outcomes, the operator positions themselves where permission is expanding. Instead of confronting systems directly, they move through the corridors where resistance is weakening. In other words, the operator stops asking, "How can I make this happen?" and begins asking, "Where is this already becoming possible?" That question produces a very different relationship with power. Power no longer means imposing will against resistance. Power becomes the ability to move with structural permission before it becomes visible to everyone else. When the visible world finally recognizes the shift, the operator is already positioned. Not because they predicted the future, but because they recognized when the architecture of reality had quietly changed. From systems to architecture. By this point, the operator mind has undergone several transformations. At first, the world appeared as a sequence of events. Then it began revealing itself as a collection of systems. But eventually another realization emerges, one that shifts perception even further. Systems themselves are not the final layer. They are components of something larger, architecture. A system is a structure that organizes behavior. Architecture is the structure that organizes systems. Most people stop their thinking at the level of systems. They analyze institutions, networks, markets, technologies, or political orders, as if each system exists independently. But systems rarely operate alone. They interact. They constrain each other. They reinforce or weaken one another across time. When the operator mind becomes stable, it begins seeing the connections between systems themselves. Economic incentives shape technological adoption. Technological capabilities reshape political power. Political stability alters institutional trust. Institutional trust changes the behavior of markets and populations. These systems do not move separately. They move as an architecture. This realization produces a powerful shift. The operator stops focusing on individual systems and begins studying how systems influence each other. Where two systems intersect, leverage appears. Where multiple systems begin reinforcing the same direction, structural acceleration occurs. Where systems contradict each other, instability begins forming. The architecture of reality is built from these interactions. This is why many observers misinterpret large transformations. They analyze only one system. They examine politics without considering technological momentum. They analyze economics without considering cultural narratives. They analyze institutions without recognizing the technological infrastructure quietly reshaping them. Because they are looking at one system at a time, they cannot see the architecture forming across systems. The operator mind does something different. It asks, which systems are beginning to align? Which pressures are reinforcing each other across multiple layers? Which contradictions are growing large enough that one system will soon reshape another? These questions reveal structural trajectories that remain invisible to event-based thinking. A technological innovation does not become dominant simply because it is powerful. It becomes dominant when the surrounding systems begin reorganizing themselves around it. A political transformation does not succeed simply because someone demands it. It succeeds when economic, technological, and institutional pressures converge in the same direction. The architecture begins shifting. Once that happens, resistance becomes increasingly difficult. From the outside, observers still see individual decisions. But the operator recognizes something else. The architecture has moved. This is the deepest reason operators appear calm, while others experience uncertainty. They are not waiting for events. They are watching the architecture of systems reorganize itself. Once that architecture shifts, visible outcomes begin cascading across the surface of reality. Events follow structure. Structure follows architecture. And architecture moves slowly enough to be seen by a trained mind. At this level of perception, the operator no longer thinks about prediction at all. Prediction belongs to the event layer. Architectural awareness belongs to a deeper layer. It is not concerned with guessing what will happen. It studies how reality organizes possibility itself. When the architecture becomes visible, the future stops looking chaotic. It begins looking directional. Possibilities narrow. Pathways emerge. Systems begin reinforcing certain movements while suppressing others. At that moment, the operator mind understands something that most observers never fully realize. Power rarely begins at the level where events become visible. It begins where architecture quietly reshapes the conditions under which systems operate. This realization completes the birth of the operator mind. But it also opens another question. If systems are shaped by architecture, who or what shapes the architecture itself? This is where the next phase begins. Because once the operator understands architecture, the next step is learning how architecture can be influenced, redesigned, and sometimes even created. And that is where the true leverage of the superhuman mind begins to emerge.